have known for a long time. Is that better? Yes. All right. So I will start with something we have known for a long time and something we believe is true until fairly recently. So we assumed when we are born, we come equipped with a certain genetic code. And that code pretty much determines that our brain will grow until it reaches a peak probably in your early 20s, late 20s, early 30s. But then really you will start losing brain tissue and your brain will start shrinking again. It shrinks. And there's nothing we can do about it. Or is there? So I want to introduce to you a concept or a phenomenon. It's called cortical plasticity. And cortical plasticity has bewildered the scientific community for quite some time now because it really contradicts this original held view that nothing can change our brain structure, except for the age-related changes I mentioned before, and also as a consequence of certain pathological processes, like for example Alzheimer's disease, autism, ADHD, schizophrenia. Okay, so over the last 10, 15 years, we have been collecting evidence that show that pretty much everything we do, every action we take, every environment we are exposed to has an impact on our brain. And of course, effects are most likely very short-term, and the effects are also taking place mostly on a very microanatomical level. That means it might change the way single neurons communicate with each other, or it might change the buildup of certain neural networks. So the question I'm interested in as a researcher is, are there certain activities, certain behaviors, certain things we can do that will actually leave an imprint on the microstructure of the brain? And can we measure it with magnetic resonance imaging? And at the beginning of my presentation tonight, I want to show you the outcomes of two very interesting studies. These studies involve taxi drivers and musicians. So let's start with the taxi drivers. As you can imagine, as a taxi driver, you need a certain set of good driving skills, maybe a little bit of aggression, but you definitely need the ability to remember things. You need to remember addresses, locations, shortcuts, spatial relations, and so on. So this is an ideal sample to study possible effects on brain structure. So that's what the researchers did. So they went out, they recruited a sample of taxi drivers in London, and they also recruited normal controls. They acquired MRI scans, and they compared the brains of these two groups. And what they found is that in taxi drivers, there's actually increased brain tissue in an area responsible for memory storage. So this finding was quite remarkable because it clearly showed there's a link between certain behavior and the macroanatomy of the brain. And similarly exciting findings were observed when looking at musicians. So this study took place in Boston, and the researcher acquired a sample of professional piano players, and they found that in these piano players, there's increased brain tissue in areas responsible for the processing of auditory motor information. So if you look at this, the black picture here on the right side, you will see this big cluster in the central part of the brain, which is responsible for the motor processing, possibly related to the finger movement, and you also see this cluster in the inferior temporal lobe, which has been shown in previous studies to be responsible to process auditory information. So two beautiful studies that really showed what we were looking for. So I always like to do research on topics I can relate to, and I do meditate, and I was wondering, so what about meditation? And I know meditating doesn't look like a lot, but I don't know if we have people in the audience, they will probably agree with me. Meditation is quite intense, especially if you do it over a long period of time and if you do it regularly.
Is that you?
Yeah, I wish. So I went out, I started recruiting people in LA, and at the end I had a neat sample of 22 meditators. And these people came from all different kinds of fields. They were musicians, they were teachers, they were painters, They were IT people. I believe we even have 3 or 4 monks from a monastery in downtown. And we didn't exclude anybody based on a certain meditation style. Our only exclusion criteria was people who had less than 5 years of meditation experience. So we acquired brain scans, and again we compared these meditators against the non-meditators, and we found that meditators have increased brain tissue in an area responsible for emotional regulation and response control. And as you can imagine, this made me very, very happy. But what does it really mean? We have established a link between a behavior and brain structure. So it could mean increased brain tissue is a consequence of meditation. Yes, but critics might say maybe the increased brain tissue is actually the cause for meditation. Maybe these people were born with a certain anatomical buildup in their brain that made them feel drawn to meditation, or that gave them the necessary motivation to stick to meditation after they've tried it once or twice. So we don't know yet. Why don't we know that? Because this is a cross-sectional study, and the same criticism applies for the taxi drivers and for the musicians. So what do? To solve this issue, to find out what's cause and consequence, we have to conduct what's called longitudinal studies. And the longitudinal study is, let me explain to you, just imagine the following scenario. I go out there, I recruit controls, I scan their brains, and I train them, I teach them how to meditate. I can do that over a long period of time, or I can make it shorter but very intense. And after I've created my own sample of meditators, I scan their brains again. And then what I can do is I can compare these two brain sets acquired at time 1 and at time 2, and whatever I find, the changes, I will know for sure they are the result of the activity. And hopefully what we will find is still increased brain tissue at time 2. Then we know the increased brain tissue is a consequence of meditation. So far there haven't been done any longitudinal studies in meditators. That's what we're gonna do next at UCLA, but I wanna share at the end of my talk the findings from 2 other longitudinal studies. And these studies looked at jugglers and medicine students. So about the jugglers. Again, researchers went out there and they recruited like ordinary people. They couldn't juggle at all. In fact, that was a criteria people had to prove they were unable to juggle. So they scanned their brains and they trained them for 3 months to hold 3 balls in the air. So it was nothing like that. 3 balls in the air for 60 seconds. So if people managed to do that, their brains were scanned again, and these 2 brain sets were compared. And what researchers found is that there was increased brain tissue in an area responsible for the perception, spatial anticipation of moving object. And you can imagine the hype this study caused, because it was for the first time they could actually prove that a certain action, a certain behavior is the cause for change in the brain. And similarly exciting outcome from the poor medicine students. So these students had to learn hard for about 3 months, day and night. They had to prepare for an exam because it's a physical in Germany. And when their brains were compared before and after, researchers actually detected increased brain tissue in area responsible for memory storage. And if maybe you remember, this is exactly the same region that was shown when looking at the taxi drivers. So I hope in my 10 minutes I could give you a little insight into how to build a bigger brain, and I hope I could show you that these findings are not just scientifically interesting, they actually apply to all of us, because they beautifully emphasize we are not 100% predetermined by our genetic code. Thank you.